Hello, it's me again, and nice to be with you. Today we are going to look at the book of Genesis. First of all, it as an introduction, and also the primeval history that we find in the book of Genesis. As we've said the last time, the book of Genesis is the book of beginnings. In it, two important ideas come to the fore. The first idea, and most important one, is the idea of God. It simply says, in the beginning, God, and therefore the book of Genesis takes God for granted in the sense that God exists, God is there, God is an idea which cannot be overlooked. And so the first important idea in Genesis is the one of the existence of God. The second important derives from the first importance, and that is the idea of created. In the beginning, God created. And why are those two ideas important ideas? First of all, God has no beginning. God is the creator of everything that is. God alone is uncreated, therefore God is what he calls himself to be holy, because nothing else can compare with him. And so, as we consider the idea of God, we consider God as the eternal one, existing from eternity past into eternity in the future. God has got no beginning, God has got no end. God is not only eternal in terms of the timeline, but God is also eternal in terms of his infinitude. In other words, there is no limit to God. There is an aspect of God that cannot be grasped within any kind of limits that prescribe him or the idea of him. So, God then is not created, he is the creator. But as one who is uncreated, he is definitely then not of the same essence as anything else, because everything else is created. What we see, and even the things we can't see, are created by God. God alone is uncreated, God alone is eternal. Everything else had a beginning, and the beginning of everything else is the creation when God created it. And everything else can have an end if God so wills, and its end will come when God brings it to an end. So the created order has not got the same attributes as God. And even though God may want to communicate some of his attributes, the essence is that we cannot fully be like God is. Okay? And so these are the two important ideas that we see in the book of Genesis. Our interest for today is basically the primeval history. Question is, what does primeval mean, or what defines the primeval history in Genesis? Primeval would mean the earliest understanding or grasp of history. Primeval history is the history before we have the written history. It is the history that comes because we understand that things are, and we understand them to be there because God created them. However, in the primeval history that is given to us in the book of Genesis, we are given an idea of four important aspects. The first theme that is important is the creation. The second theme of importance is the fall of man. The third important theme is the flood narrative or the deluge. And then the fourth one is the nations. So the primeval history would have these four things as the main themes. Now, the book of Genesis really is the prologue not only to the Pentateuch, but it is the prologue of the whole Bible. We cannot even begin to understand both the Pentateuch and the Bible unless there was a Genesis. So Genesis is an important book. It is the most important book because it gives us the foundations both of life and of everything else. And God really is that foundation. Now, if we look at the fact that Genesis then depicts for us the beginning of the human race, Genesis also is important to depict to us the beginning of the Hebrew race. And so when we talk about the human race, its beginnings, we think largely of the primeval history. And when we think of the Hebrew race, then we think of the latter part of Genesis, which is then from chapter 12 to chapter 50. What does that mean? That means then that the primeval history is found in Genesis chapter 1 to chapter 11. Genesis chapter 1 to chapter 11. The four themes I mentioned a little earlier on, they are found in the first 11 chapters of Genesis: the creation, the fall of man, the flood, and the Tower of Babel, or the beginning of the nations. We are going to talk about these four themes in this particular lesson, and so let's begin by talking about the creation. As far as the narrative of the creation is concerned, we are simply told that in the beginning, God. God was there. We are not told where God comes from. We are just given this thought that God is there. God exists. And if you go further into Christian doctrine, we believe that God has got no beginning. God doesn't come from anywhere because He is everywhere. And therefore, when we speak about God, we take God as taken for granted in the book of Genesis and also in the whole Bible. The whole Bible doesn't need to explain God or who God is or what God consists of or where God comes from or many other things that one can ask about God. Certainly, because the Bible is God's revelation, and we can know nothing about God unless God Himself reveals it to us. So we believe in revelation, and the Bible is God's revelation to us. Now, coming to the creation, this God who was at the beginning made everything that is. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and everything in it was created by God. We are told, first of all, that everything was without form and it was empty, and darkness pervaded over the face of everything. And so, at the beginning, that is what has been created. Well, we are also told that God created everything that is in 6 days. The word that is used in Hebrew is yom, and in the normal sense of our understanding, it means a 24-hour day. But in this case, we cannot necessarily think of it as a 24-hour day. Many believe that it was a 24-hour day. Many don't. And so, therefore, there are many proposals made as to how long each of these days were. What was their duration is one of the big questions, and one of those questions, I believe, cannot be answered. Nevertheless, the Bible tells us that God created everything that is in 6 days, and on the seventh day, God rested. Now, we'll come to the rest of the seventh day a little later on. But right now, we are talking about the creation, and we are looking at the idea of the day. It doesn't matter to me whether the day is 24 hours or or 1,000 years, as Peter says, one day with the Lord is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day. I'm not concerned about that, and I don't think you should be, because that's one question we just can't solve. And whoever makes a case for whatever duration of the day, that is just a speculation, and this is what they are able to put forward in the way that they do, but it doesn't settle the matter. Okay, so we are told that God created the heavens and the earth, and in the first day there was just formlessness and emptiness and darkness. But in the second day, we are told that God created the sky, the expanse. He separated the waters, and we see then He separates the skies when He creates an expanse, and so that the earth and the skies are separated. Incidentally, God created light first, and the light was what was there. And we know that every day is measured by the statement, and it was evening and it was morning the first day, and it was evening and it was morning the second day, and so forth. It goes to the sixth day. And we know that in that second day came a separation of waters, and the expanse was separated from the earth, and we now have the heavens and the earth. But on the third day, we are told that God separated the waters, and in such a way that the waters gave way for land, and so you have land and sea. And so on that third day, the land was created or brought to the surface, however that happened. But on the third day, the seas were separated and land appeared. And we're also told that there on the third day, God created vegetation and seeds and fruit. And so what grew on the land all happened on the third day. Now, coming back to the duration of the day, surely God can just create everything in a second. God has got that power. God is all powerful. And God didn't need 24 hours, and neither does God need thousands of years. But however God willed it, that is how it was, and that is how He has created. And I don't think we can say with definiteness that it was a 24-hour day or 1,000 years day or whatever other length of day it might have been. But on the third day, God created the land and the vegetation, seeds and fruit that came on it. On day 4, we are told that God created the sun, the moon, and the stars, and that the sun gave light to the earth, and the moon gave light to the earth at night. The moon was a lesser light, the sun was the greater light, and the stars, obviously, you can know that these are spread all throughout the universe. But the story isn't told us in a scientific way. The Bible isn't meant to be a science book. So, in other words, this history, the primeval history, only gives what is necessary without details, without describing necessarily how. But on the fourth day, God created sun, moon, stars, and that means when we go back again to the issue of day, it could not have been a 24-hour day, I believe, and you may differ. I don't mind if you differ from me. Excuse me. But if the sun was created on the fourth day, and we know that the 24-hour day measurement is in relation to the sun. The rotation of the earth in relation to the sun is what gives us our days, and later on actually also even our seasons. And so I don't think that there would have been a 24-hour day or the seasons prior to the creation of the sun, moon, and stars. However, that might be, you can decide for yourself, but God created the sun, moon, and stars on the fourth day. Then on day number 5, all the creatures in the waters and in the sky were created, and they were given the instruction to multiply. And we see that then God's intention is to create life, and life is found, yes, in the vegetation, and God has allowed the seeds and the fruit there to cause multiplication, and now other life forms are also created, and they are instructed to multiply. And so God had this idea of procreation, and we see that that is the case, that everything was able to multiply itself. So that was on the 5th day that God created all the creatures of the waters, the sky, and given them the ability to procreate. Then on day number 6, which is the last day of creation, God created all the land creatures, the livestock, and finally God created man. God created man to rule over the earth. Man alone has been created in the image of God. So there was something special about man, something more special about man than all other creatures. And in man was vested the image of God. We are not always sure as to what the extent or what the meaning of that idea, the image of God, is in man, but I can already say that in the ways that we are different from other creatures, at least to that extent, we can say that the image of God is vested in us. We are told that God also said to man that he is to multiply. The creatures, all other creatures and livestock, were given the commandment to multiply. Man was also to multiply, and so was man created. And then we are told that on the seventh day, God rested. The seventh day was called the Sabbath. And the Sabbath has been in place, or at least in the biblical understanding, there since the creation of the world. Now, let's come back to man. When God created man in his own image, we are told that God breathed into man and man became a living soul. Man became a living being. Now, there's also something else that must be stated here. You have heard maybe of the word ex nihilo, that God created everything out of nothing. In other words, God only had to say, let it be, and it was. That for the most is true, but when it comes to the land creatures and man, it would seem from the text, if you would read there in Genesis chapter 2, that God created man from the dust of the earth, and God created woman from man. So we can then agree that not everything was created ex nihilo, but God created man and other creatures and woman from pre-existing materials. So, the Sabbath day is the day on which God rested. And I said we were going to speak about the rest on the seventh day. First of all, God is all-powerful. We know that. God is infinite. We know that. That means that God has infinite power. And if God has infinite power, then the creation of everything did not tire God, because God could not expend anything from him. In other words, he cannot lose anything, and that also means he cannot gain anything, because God already is perfect. And so therefore the Sabbath day was not for God to rest from tiredness as we understand it. And what does it mean? Well, some versions try to influence the thinking around this issue, that God didn't rest because he was tired, but actually God rested from creative activity. In other words, God stopped his creative activity. And so in that case, the word rest is not to recover, but the word rest is to say that God ceased his creative activities. Now, I'm quite happy to go with that, because, yes, I do believe that God is infinitely powerful, that to God cannot be added anything, and from God cannot be taken away anything. So, God created man, and God created man in his own image. Then we are told that God placed the man in the garden. There was a special garden. The garden is described for us. It had four arterials of rivers, and it was a well-watered garden. It had everything, and God placed man in this garden, and man was to rule the whole earth. And man is still to rule over all of God's creation. God placed in the middle of the garden the tree of life and also the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and God tells the man not to eat of this. As far as creating the woman, we know that God opened the side of the man and took one of his bones on the side, and God created a woman. And God created a woman so that the woman could be a mate to the man. God said that it isn't good for man to be alone, and amongst all the other creatures that God created, God couldn't find a suitable mate for the man, and God created a woman, and God created a woman for the man. Now, I think from the creation narrative, we can then glean a number of things. First of all, we can glean God's intention. God's intention in the first place is to show that He is Creator God, that He created everything according to the rest of the Bible for His own pleasure, for His own purpose. God created these things. We also know that God created things the way He created them because this is how God intended the creation to be. And so, for instance, if God created man to rule over all of creation, then it would be against God's creation intention that other creatures should assume the rulership over man. And so we see that, in fact, that has not been the case since the creation. Man has always ruled over everything else. And however wild or untamed certain things were, man always had the upper hand over it, because God gave to man the intention to rule over everything. Also, from that intention, we see that God created a person in the form of Eve, the woman, to be a mate for the man and to rule together with him. The woman comes from the man, and so the woman is called flesh of my flesh and bone of my bones by the man. So, in other words, they were made in the same likeness. They were made of the same substance, and we know that therefore they are equal in every way. So we believe in the equality of all mankind and the equality of man and woman. And even though I am saying that, I also do believe that God created in the scriptures a particular role to be had by the man as opposed to the woman, and by the woman as opposed to the man. And so part of God's creation intention can be seen in the way that God created things. That means then that we need to deal with the aspect of marriage. God created marriage because in chapter 2, as He gives the detail of the creation of man, we are told that God made the woman for the man, He brought the woman to the man, and they became one flesh. That means they were married, they consummated their marriage in sexual union, and they have been one since. And so, therefore, marriage, according to the creation intention, is between a man and a woman as God created them. And so I would say there that therefore we can judge whether things like homosexuality or homo marriages are according to God's intention or not, but certainly the scriptures actually also even speak against homosexuality. So that was the creation. God created everything, and God created everything good. In fact, after every day's creation, God saw that it was good. And even after the creation, God saw that it was very good. So everything that God created good, because God in His own nature is good, and therefore everything that God creates will be good. The second important theme is now what we need to turn to, and you can see there that it is the fall of man we are now speaking. Now, when I say man, I do not mean masculine man, but I mean humanity or mankind. So the fall of man, or the fall of humanity, or the fall of mankind. What do we mean by the concept, the fall of man, or the fall of humanity, or the fall of mankind? If we go back to the creation story, when God placed the man and the woman in the garden, and God said to them, "From every tree you may eat, from every plant you may enjoy, but of the tree in the middle of the garden you are not to eat." So this was the instruction that God gave man. And God said to them, "In the day that you eat from it, you will surely die." Now that is what Adam and Eve believed, because this is what God told them. Until they found themselves in Genesis chapter 3 in the garden, and they are tempted by Satan. Now, you may ask yourself the question, where does Satan come from? Now, that's going to be a bit of a side issue, but I think I need to explain it in the briefest way that I can to you. The Bible says that God created everything, and God created also even the spirit world. We know that God created angels, and that angels are spiritual beings, and that angels were created to serve God and to glorify God, and this is what they did. But then the angel of light, according to Isaiah chapter 14, Lucifer, became proud, and Lucifer wanted to assume the place, the throne of God. And because Lucifer was so ambitious and so proud, by his pride he fell, and God threw him out of heaven, expelled him from heaven. But if we take the story from Revelation, and also in the apocalyptic writings, we are told that a third of the angels followed Lucifer. And that means that a third of the angels became fallen angels, and they were expelled from the presence of God. Now, in angelology or demonology, we refer to the fallen angels as demons, and they do the bidding of Satan or Lucifer, who became Satan, the devil, and they have ever since been against God, and anything that stood for God, or anything that was meant for God's glory, they stood against this. So Satan came about in that way. I can only imagine that Satan was cast out of heaven between the creation of man and this narrative where he now comes to tempt man. We are not told this. I can only speculate it, and I cannot state that for certain. So I am telling you up front, I don't really know how this happened or when this happened, but it is generally as I described it to you as we glean that story from Isaiah chapter 14. So Satan came, and Satan tempted man or humanity. Did God say that you shall not eat of this tree? Or did God say that you shall not eat of any tree? I think he was so sly in his approach to humanity that they said, no, God said we can have of everything that is here in the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil we are not to eat, because if we eat thereof we will die. And Satan puts doubt in their mind. Will you will surely not die. In fact, God knows that in the day that you eat of the fruit, you will become like him, and you will know like him good and evil. Now, I don't exactly know what the attraction might have been, but we hear from the story that the fruit that was offered to them by Satan looked good and desirous. And I would imagine even the possibility of being like God and knowing the difference between good and evil may also have been attractive for them. But we do know that ultimately they obey Satan. They eat of the fruit that God told them not to eat of. And it is then that they, for the first time, discovered that they are naked. Now, you will see there in chapter 2 that when they were created, they were both naked, and the Bible says they felt they had no shame. But after the fall, when they obeyed Satan and disobeyed God, they discovered that they were naked. And then they had shame. And then they hid themselves, because we are told that God walked in the garden and they hid themselves from God. Why would they do that? They gave the excuse because they knew that they were naked. Well, that then meant that they had disobeyed God, they could no longer be in the presence of God, and they could no longer have fellowship with God. Before the fall, they dwelt in the presence of God, and was, as is seen here, God came to the garden in the cool of the day, and God walked in the garden. And if that's the case, then it is possible that they had fellowship with God in the garden, and having the presence of God and the fellowship with God was really what God wanted when he created man. But came the fall. Man was now separated from God, and the curse that was to come upon them because of their disobedience. In the day that you eat thereof, you shall surely die. Now, they didn't die immediately, but this was the beginning of them dying, and until ultimately they died. And we believe even that the death was not just a physical death, but it was also a spiritual death. God gave them a curse, and the curse of man was that he would have to work hard for a living. He would earn his income, his living, by the sweat of his brow. We are told that the woman was cursed in the sense that giving birth will be a painful event for her and for all women who come after her. And then God cursed Satan as well, who presented himself in the form of a serpent, and God told him that he will sail on his belly for all of his life, and that he will be trampled upon his head by the man, but also that he would bite the man on the heel. And we know that that has been the case with snakes in general, and the snake, which in this particular case represented Satan, is cursed to that estate. This was the fall of man. Man sinned. Now, if you go to, for instance, a passage like Romans chapter 5, from verse 12, we are told there that sin entered into the world through one man. That one man is Adam. Now, even though Eve was the one that took the first bite of what Satan offered and gave to her husband Adam, we are told that the responsibility is with the man. And so Adam is given as the one who sinned. Man sinned, and the first man, Adam, sinned, and death was passed on to him, and death passed on to every man after that, because all men have sinned, or all people have sinned, all of mankind sinned. And so the fall of Adam and Eve, when they were tempted by Satan and fell to that temptation, was not only the fall of them, but was the fall of all humanity, because they would pass on sin and death to all of humanity, and so all of humanity sin. In fact, the Bible says, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. The Bible also says, if anyone says he has no sin, he is a liar. The truth doesn't dwell in him. And so no one can say that they do not have any sin, or they have not ever committed any sin, at least as a grown-up person. And so we all are concluded under sin, and because that is the case, we all need salvation. We know that in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, we have what is called the proto-evangelion, which means the first gospel, and we know there that from the seed of the woman, which ultimately refers to the Lord Jesus Christ, salvation will come to mankind. So all of humanity fell into sin. All of humankind now are sinners. And so that story is given to us in the primeval history as well. Let's move on now to the flood. Now, the flood has got the precursor of people living and filling and populating the earth. In fact, we are given people that reached ages over 900 years old, and so they lived for a very long time, and they grew evil, and evil was added upon evil until God, in fact, the language that is used is just a rhetorical function of language. God regretted that he had made man. And so God deliberated that he was going to wipe out man from the face of the earth. But there was one man, Noah, who was found to be righteous, and him and his family, he had a wife and 3 sons, and they had 3 wives. So in other words, the 3 sons and their 3 wives, 6 people, and Noah and his wife, 8 people. And so for a total of 8 people, God was going to spare these 8 people because Noah was righteous. We know that righteousness in Hebrews chapter 11 is normally defined by the willingness to have faith in God. And so Noah was a man of faith, and because of his faith, he was a righteous man, because faith is not just simply believing that God is, but faith is actually doing what pleases God because you believe that He is. So God, having determined that He's going to wipe out all of humanity, told Noah to build an ark. Now, an ark is maybe just a supersized ship or boat, and God said He wants Noah to create an ark or to build an ark. God gave him the dimensions of it, and God was going to use the ark not only to save the 8 people who were now seen as righteous, but also to save some of the animals that God wanted to continue on the earth after the flood. Now, during this time of wickedness, in which Noah alone was righteous, there were Nephilim. Nephilim are normally associated with giants, and they were said to have been wicked men, and they roamed and ruled the earth, and this is perhaps one of the reasons also God decided to wipe out mankind. Now, when the flood was finished, we are told that Noah and his family are told to get into the ark, and we are also told that God brings the animals and they are placed in the ark. They are to be 2 by 2 of different kinds of animals. We're not told more than that. We're only told that the clean animals, the 7 of them must be put into the ark because they will be used for food and for sacrifice to God. And this is what Noah does. And comes the time, the ark was closed, and Noah and his family are saved because God opens the floodgates, both rain from above and the springs from the earth, and the floodgates are opened, and all of humanity and everything else perishes in this flood. And only Noah and those who are in the flood, and obviously marine life, those who were saved, and everything else is wiped out. We know that Noah stayed in the ark for a number of days, something like 3 or 4 months, and we also know that as the water receded, Noah sent out birds, different kinds of birds, and until one of them didn't return, and so it was obvious that there was place for that bird to land and to nest and whatever else birds do. But the flood destroyed everything. You can see that I've written there on your notes creation and uncreation, and so you can also see that as when God created everything that there was just water all over, and now when God uncreates, there is water all over, and by that the uncreation comes. But God starts with a new family, and with that new family, God is going to populate the earth again. That was the flood. Lastly, we come to the nations, or the theme of Babel. The Tower of Babel is what man wanted to create. What motivated them was, let's make a great name for ourselves, and let's build a tower that will go up high into heaven. And the project dimensions required them to work together, and they do work together, and we don't quite know how far they get, but we also know that, again, in rhetorical expression, God says, let us go down and see what they are doing, and God decides that He is going to frustrate the project by sowing confusion among them, and the confusion would come by God changing their languages. So God introduced there the different languages, and we know that they, uh, because they could not understand each other during the project, they had to now find themselves those who do understand their language, and they would then stay together because they spoke the same language and understood the same language, and this is how the nations came to exist. The movements to migrate away from where the tower was would have happened naturally, I suppose. Now, just remember that we are only told that God brought confusion upon them and gave them to speak different languages. We are not told what I said to you, that they would find each other, those who understand each other, but that is quite a reasonable conclusion to make, an assumption to make. And so the nations were created, and then came the dispersion all across the world, and we believe that that is how the nations came to be from this whole story. Now, the Tower of Babel and the confusion of the languages, I must say, isn't it interesting? And you will find it interesting that in Acts chapter 2, on the day of Pentecost, instead of people being dispersed, the people from the dispersion came to Jerusalem. And the people from the dispersion heard the gospel preached to them in their own language, the various languages. And they even said, but are these not Galileans? How is it that we are hearing them preach this good news to us in our own language? And so we see that the gospel is now restoring a one nation, as it were. And that one nation, as it were, is depicted in the church. So the church then is the body or the people of God that consists of all the nations, and that is why we are given the mandate to preach the gospel to all the nations throughout the earth, because that is what God intended, that from all the nations there will be a people whom He calls His people that will honor Him and live for Him. We're almost at the end of our lecture. Just bear with me as I touch on what I'm showing you now. Yes, I said to you that the rest of the book of Genesis is the creation of the Hebrew race. God called a man, Abraham, from the Mesopotamian basin, and God brought him to the land that God was going to show him. God made a covenant with him, and in that covenant God made certain promises to him. And we know that the promise that God made to Abraham is essentially threefold. God was going to increase his seed. God was going to bless him. God was going to bless the nations through him. And God was going to, thirdly, give him land. So the promise was of seed, of blessing, and of land. Well, Abraham did not have children until he had Ishmael from a concubine, and then his wife was barren, but later on, by God's doing, she gave birth to Isaac. Isaac also married a woman who was barren, and God opened up her womb, and she gave birth to Jacob and his brother. And we also know that Jacob married a barren woman, and he had a number of wives, concubines, and his wife, uh, his two wives that he worked for, and then he had 12 sons and one daughter. And the 12 sons that Jacob had were to become the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, the name Israel comes from the name that God gave to Jacob. God wrestled with Jacob, and God gave Jacob a new name when he said to him, "No longer will your name be Jacob or heel grabber, but you will be Israel from now on." And so the 12 sons of Jacob would then be the 12 sons of Israel, and therefore the 12 sons of Israel would later come to represent the 12 tribes of Israel. Joseph was one of Jacob's sons, and he was Jacob's favorite son, but he was hated by his brothers, and he was really sent into slavery by them, and he landed up in slavery in Egypt. And the whole story in Egypt is what sets the scene for the book of Exodus and for the books that come after that, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So we see then Abraham's movement was to Haran. Let me repeat that. The movement of the people that were in the Garden of Eden, when they were cast out of the garden, we see that the next place where we are moved in history is to Haran, and that's where Abram was, and he's called, and he believes God and does what God wants him to do, and so he moves from Haran to Canaan, and God was going to give him the land of the Canaanites, but we see that the story develops in the rest of Genesis, the movement from Canaan to Egypt, and that's where the book of Genesis ends. So that is the end of our lecture. Thank you, and God bless you.